always get these comments that say, you know, the nurses are terrible, they're lazy, toxic, and a lot of times these are from personal experience as patients, or these are coming from like either a CNA or like maybe a doctor, maybe even like a colleague. And I feel like it's kind of hard to generalize nurses because how many nurses are there in the United States?
Yeah, over 3 million.
But we certainly have worked, not just in Kaiser, and I'm talking about in general. I've worked in 3 different hospitals, but we've worked with nurses that are just terrible. We've gotten comments that said that Kaiser nurses, specifically Kaiser nurses, are lazy, terrible, and overall like heartless nurses.
When I hear that comment, I think about people judge the entire police force based on the actions of a few or one individual. It's very similar to how someone may react to a nurse who's a terrible nurse, and they might have a negative perception, a negative future perception of all nurses based on the actions of one nurse. And I feel like that just is not the way to treat an entire profession based on one individual's actions. When Monica is talking about how someone said that Kaiser nurses are awful nurses, I think back all of my experience as a nurse. I've been a nurse now for like 11 years. And I think about all of the great nurses I've worked with. The majority of nurses are amazing nurses. And I think of them as family, right? Like you come to work every single day, you spend half of your life at work, and thankfully, most of the time that I've been at work, the individuals that I've worked with are great. I enjoy working with them every single day. But there are those select few that will ruin an experience, not just for you, but for the patients, and may even result in like a safety issue for the patient. So this video is about those very few nurses that may ruin it for the entire profession, and how hospitals need to stop hiring these nurses because it does ruin it for all of us.
I do want to preface this by saying that, you know, nursing is one of the most trusted profession. You know, for many, many years now, they did these Gallup polls, and they said, #1, nurses is always up there. So I haven't seen the recent results, but we're pretty much up there. A lot of people trust us.
Yeah, the most trusted profession, nursing.
So
by far.
I've worked in 3 different hospitals. Jason also has worked in 3 different hospitals. So in the 3 different hospitals I've worked at, of course, there's always gonna be that 1 or 2 or 3 nurses that are just terrible, lazy. And at my job, okay, I work night shift. I work in a telemetry floor. And I'm gonna tell you that right now, if I'm gonna be brutally honest, I know about 1 or 2 or 3 nurses that are just terrible. Okay, it's very few, like compared to the other hospitals I've worked at. This is just my experience at my shift. So I feel like the management team that I work at are really good at scouting these nurses, and a lot of them are travel nurses. So when these, you know, when you're a traveler and you want to work at Kaiser, a lot of the times these travelers, they come in and they put in 1,000 hours of experience with us, which, you know, for where I work in South Sac. So AMN is the only travel company that contracts to Kaiser. So you put in your 1,000 hours. So we kind of scout these nurses and see how well they do in our floor. And for the most part, if you do very well, we'll hire you. Sometimes we have internal transfers. Sometimes we get nurses from another Kaiser. And our management, they listen to us. First of all, management, this is so rare. They listen to our opinion of the nurses on the floor. So I am gonna tell you right now, like 98% of the nurses that I worked with, and I'm talking about day shift, night shift, PM shift, are great nurses. Like these are the nurses that will drop everything to help our patients. They will not leave on time just so they can make sure everything is done during their shift. These are the nurses you want your family to get taken care of. Okay, and I trust these nurses. Like if I were to get sick at my hospital, I knew like I can trust these nurses. But of course, there's always gonna be a few nurses that are gonna be lazy and they're bullies and mean to other colleagues. So you can talk about your experience.
Well, first, okay, I wanna mention, like I said, in the 11 years that I've worked as a nurse, the majority of my experience has been extremely positive. And I think very highly of most of the nurses that I've worked with. But there have been times where I've asked myself, why did I become a nurse? And that's based on some of the negative experiences that I've had with other nurses. Because before I became a nurse, I used to work in like corporate America. And I didn't deal with as much negativity in my career until I became a nurse, right? And one experience that I'll give you is I remember when I was working at one of the larger hospitals in New York City, and there was a situation where the temperature outside was probably like 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was freezing cold outside. And at the time, the governor had passed like some sort of mandate that said hospitals are required to allow homeless individuals to stay in the emergency department waiting room as a warming shelter so that they wouldn't freeze to death outside. And there was this elderly lady who had been sleeping in the waiting room, and she had a shopping cart with some other belongings with her, but she was sleeping there. She looked like she was about 80 years old. And I remember at the time, I was the triage nurse and there was another charge nurse. And the charge nurse that day came up to me and asked me why I was allowing these homeless individuals to sleep in our waiting room. And I said, first of all, there's a mandate that says that we're required to allow these homeless individuals to sleep in our waiting room when it's freezing outside. Secondly, she's an elderly woman, so even if there weren't a mandate, I will still let her sleep in our waiting room. And she was extremely upset with me, went up to the elderly woman and told her she had to leave. And I said, no, you can't do that. You cannot do that. I don't care what the policy is in this hospital. She's like 80 years old, and you're telling her that she has to leave the hospital to go out there in freezing temperatures, and she might possibly freeze to death. It's not right. And this charge nurse was known to bully other nurses. But I went up to my director the day after, and I told him this situation. Thankfully, we had an amazing director. He brought this nurse up to his office, and he said, don't you ever do that again. You need to think of these people, whether they're patients or not, as family members. And that really stuck with me because that's how I treat everybody, regardless of whether they're a patient or not. If they come to our hospital, I'm always going to treat them as if it were like my own family member. That's just one experience. That nurse was known for being like that with every other nurse. She would always bully other nurses and make other nurses feel extremely uncomfortable at work. And she kept her job. They never fired her. She continued to do that even after this experience that I had with her. That's one experience that I had, but it happens in every hospital. There may be that one nurse, or those two nurses, or a few nurses that might have the habit of causing turmoil or like negativity in the department, and it can ruin it for a lot of people in the department. And that's why this video is meant for these type of nurses. We shouldn't be hiring nurses like this, and they shouldn't keep their jobs if they do things like this, because it ruins it for everyone who works with them.
You know, it gives me so much satisfaction when there's this one specific nurse that I worked with before. I would come in, he would give me a report, and oh my God, it's just, you already knew that patient was gonna be a train wreck. And just certain situations where I feel like it's just unacceptable. There's no excuse. Patients that are left like in their piss for a long time, and it's just inexcusable. If this nurse had a preceptee, and the preceptee was also an experienced nurse. So I thought, like, this is not right. Why is this okay? And again, that nurse, a lot of other nurses complained about him, and he still is working in that department.
And maybe you should talk about your experience in endoscopy.
Oh my gosh. So, my time to shine, my goodness, I thought I would never be able to talk about this ever on social media. So when I went from bedside, I did med-surg for 2 years. I was super burnt out. So I decided to transfer over from Mount Sinai to New York Presbyterian. This was in the Allen Hospital, Northern Manhattan. And when I went there, it was mostly older nurses, okay? So they were very set in their ways. So this is also the reason why I didn't like endoscopy too, because I love endoscopy, but there's just one specific reason. It's because you didn't really have a lot of autonomy. So she was my preceptee, and the worst part was she was Filipino. So she was one of those toxic titas. And I have never, it takes a lot for me to cry, but she made me cry so many times at that job because she just never gave me my autonomy, and she didn't let me learn from my mistakes. It was me and another coworker of mine, the two young nurses. She would always bully us and just never let us just commingle with all the other nurses. So until this day, so I remember, thankfully, NYP, again, management, I feel like management in NYP is just like much better than Sinai, because when I left, I did an exit interview, and oh my gosh, her name is Allison Nung. She got married, but that wasn't her previous name. So she asked me, she was kind of trying to pry it out of me because she knew something was up in that unit. She's like, was there anybody at that unit that you felt like you didn't feel comfortable with? And you know what? I was so grateful that she asked me that question, because I spoke up and said, you know, this nurse, this is what happened the entire time I worked there. She gave that nurse a really poor performance review. And then another one of my younger colleagues spoke up about her. And then so when that happened, again, she got another poor performance review, and she said she was very unwelcoming to the newcomers. So yes, nurses do eat their young, okay? And I feel like, I'm not gonna say every single Filipino is like that, but it's heavy on our culture. The older titas or maybe the titos, like they eat their young, especially if you're Filipino. I feel like other cultures would speak up a little bit more about that. But us, we're trying to be like respectful to our elders. We don't usually bark back. But I only did endoscopy for a year because of that. Not because of her, but eventually we did move to California.
And then, when I went to Sutter Roseville, I had a positive experience with Sutter Roseville. But I know some of my female coworkers who were brand new to the department, they said that they felt like they were being bullied at work every single day they came to work by some of the more senior nurses. And it's unfortunate that that happens because, there's sometimes I read comments from nurses that are new grads that are like not even a year into their profession, and they said they're already burned out. And most of this happens because of unsupportive colleagues. Nurses that have been seasoned, that have been there for a long time, don't want to support their colleagues. And I remember when I first started working as a nurse, that was kind of like the environment that I was working in. And I said, you know what? No, this is not going to happen with me around. This is going to change. So when I first started working there, this was at Jamaica Hospital. All of the nurses, it was like almost as if it was every man for themselves. And I said, guys, if we work together, we can get things done faster. So I changed the culture immediately as soon as I started working there. And by the time I left, it was like, first of all, I hated working there, but I loved the people that I worked with because they became like family to me. So it was a very emotional experience when I left that place because we all had gotten to the point where like we were all working frequently together and we were all there to help each other out, and it just made the day so much better.
In all honesty, I don't think it makes, if you work in a floor and you work in bedside, it doesn't make any sense for you to just bully your colleague because you're burning bridges. If you ever need something from that colleague, God forbid it's like one of your patient crashes, who are you going to lean to? Your colleagues, whether they're young, they're old, you have to work as a team. It doesn't matter what their background is, how long have they been a nurse. So I really understand why nurses have to eat their young.
Yeah, and part of the reason why I wanted to make this video is because I've interviewed so many nurses that now have their own business, they're making a lot of money, but they quit their job because they were being bullied at work. And that's not how the profession should be. Like, people shouldn't go into nursing,
This is supposed to be a caring profession.
Yeah, exactly.
And why are you coming into this profession, being this way? It's unacceptable.
I will say though that I also work with nurses or have worked with nurses who have been moved from one shift to the other, not one department to the other, but one shift to the other because the one shift that they were previously working on all couldn't handle the bullying that was happening in that shift. So they ganged up together. They said this nurse needs to go. But instead of, laying off the nurse or firing the nurse, they just moved her to a different shift. And, that's the thing that I should say that's the negative aspect of being part of a union.
Mm-hmm.
If you work for a hospital that does not have unions, it's easy to get rid of an employee who's a toxic employee. But if you're working for a hospital that has a union, they have to go through union meetings. The union has to be present during your conversations with the employee, and they will back up the employee. They would have to do like remediation with the employee and try to solve the issue of bullying in other ways before they resort to firing the employee. So it can take years, and the employee has to literally be causing harm to a patient in order for them to be fired. Otherwise, you're likely going to continue working with them.
It's crazy. A lot of these times, these nurses are union savvy because they know their way around the handbook and our union rules. So that's why they don't end up getting fired, or they always end up keeping their job because they're savvy in other ways. And this applies to coworkers I've worked with.
That's very true. If you've noticed, most of these nurses that are extremely toxic to the department know the ins and outs of their contract, and they will know exactly how to get away with whatever toxic behavior they have.
If you miss your meds, this and that, I understand. We all get busy. It's a 24-hour job, but there are some things I just cannot let go, and we all have to speak up for the sake of our patients.
I had a situation one time where this one nurse had to spike a bag of Rocephin, right? And you have the vial, right? You have the adapter, and then you have B5 or you have saline. And this nurse had to spike the vial into the adapter and then the adapter into the bag. Well, I don't know what happened in the mix of things, but when I walked past this patient's room, I noticed there was a puddle of what appeared to be a liquid on the patient's floor, and the pump kept going off. And from the bag was hanging a vial that was shattered. And I was wondering, like, what was going on, because this vial was shattered, but the medication and the IV was still connected to the patient.
The vial was shattered, or was it spiked?
The vial was spiked and shattered.
Huh.
And it was hanging, the bag was hanging from the hook, right? And everything was connected to the pump, and the tubing was connected to the patient. So I walked up to the nurse who had this patient, and he kept going back and forth, like past the room. It's like he was avoiding addressing the issue with the pump and with the vial.
The pump was beeping.
The pump was beeping. Mm-hmm. And at one point, I did see him going into the room and just pressed, like, to continue to run the pump. But in my mind, I'm like, what are you doing? There could be possible shattered glass in this bag that the patient is receiving, and you're still trying to run the pump? Like, address the issue. So I told him, I was like, you need to stop the pump. Like, the glass is shattered. You don't know if this patient is receiving some of this medication with shattered glass. If you address the issue and you really took it serious, I would be like, okay, you know what, let's try to figure this out. But he didn't, so I had to bring it up.
I just want to preface this. I don't want to sound like we're the bullies, okay?
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of safety. We're not perfect. I've made mistakes before.
Yeah.
We've all made mistakes before, granted, but we're just trying to say, like, it's just really for the sake of safety and our patients.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to say we're perfect.
Absolutely not. But the thing is, if you were to deal with that situation with an open mind and, like, the understanding that, yeah, maybe I made a mistake, as opposed to, like,
you have to own up to it.
Yeah, as opposed to, like, oh, why are you even making a big deal out of it? It's not that big of a deal.
That's not safe.
It's a safety issue for the patient, right? So, like, when it comes to safety issues and concerns, you have to take it seriously, because look what happened with the Redonda Vaught case, where she was a float nurse and she was gonna medicate a patient with Versed, but instead of Versed, she pulled out Vecuronium. Vecuronium is a paralyzer, it's a paralytic. That's a huge issue, and it can cause harm or even kill a patient.
Also, I wanted to address the fact that just because Kaiser nurses get paid well, we get a lot of support, again, it doesn't mean we're lazy.
Yeah.
Okay, of course there are gonna be some lazy Kaiser nurses, but again, very hard to generalize. There's 30 Kaiser hospitals and like 22 medical clinics. I have to look this up again. Hard to generalize, guys.
I feel like the fact that nurses are compensated well in the Kaiser system.
That's the bridge you don't want to burn.
Yes. Yeah, they're compensated well, and we have excellent working conditions compared to many other places that I've worked in. To be honest, it's probably better working conditions than any other place I've worked in, because we have float nurses, we have resource nurses, we just have so much support staff that you don't want to ruin that type of opportunity to be able to work for an employer like that.
So yeah, I wouldn't burn bridges with them. So that's why the stakes are high. You want to put in your best because you're getting paid well, better working conditions, and this is one of the hospitals you don't want to burn bridges with. Yeah, but not to say like all the other hospitals, like the nurses. I don't know about NYP. When I worked in endoscopy, like there was a very few good nurses, but in Sinai, I have some really, really good nurses there too. But then again, if I could just sum it up, I would say like our Kaiser nurses rock.
If you as an employer want to retain your nurses, then stop hiring nurses that are toxic for the department. Just want to put that out there.
Or maybe let them go if they're not a good fit.
Let them go. Exactly, let them go. Because you might not know they're toxic from the get-go. But once you realize that, get rid of them.
Move them to a different department. You don't have to fire them, put them in the clinic.
Yeah, then they're gonna be toxic at the clinic. So I hope you got something out of this video. And if you want more videos in the future, let us know what topics you want us to address, and we'll do that in a future video, right? Bye.